The ink was still wet when I felt that hollow click of a door closing, the one I thought led to freedom. For 7 years, I'd been a silent investor in the Callaway version of family, a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill. I signed the papers at 9 a.m. By 10:30, my former mother-in-law, Cynthia, was at the Gilded Cask, reserving a $6,500 banquet to introduce my replacement. She had no idea I'd already performed the audit. In that position, would you have driven home to cry, or would you have waited to see exactly how much they thought your 7 years of sacrifice were worth? The silence in the parking lot felt like an accusation. I sat in my car, the interior still smelling of the wood-paneled law office and the heavy, dry scent of ink. I looked at the divorce papers sitting on the passenger seat. My married name was already a ghost, crossed out by my own hand. My phone vibrated against the center console. It was Diane, my cousin-in-law, the only one in that entire vineyard orbit who still possessed a functional conscience. Her voice was low, rhythmic, and strained, as if she were relaying coordinates from a trench. She was calling from the lobby of the Gilded Cask. She told me the florist had delivered 3 dozen white lilies, my favorites, naturally to the Callaway table. Cynthia had moved with the precision of a hostile takeover, reserving the VIP vault before I had even cleared the building. She was hosting a gala for 14 guests, and the centerpiece of the evening wasn't just the wine. It was a woman named Alyssa, young, soft-spoken, and already wearing a ring that looked suspiciously like a family heirloom I'd once been promised. I felt a dangerous stillness settle in my lungs. It wasn't the heat of rage, it was the cold, clinical temperature of an audit. I realized then that Cynthia didn't just want me gone. She wanted to erase the very soil from under my fingernails and replace it with a clean, compliant mannequin who wouldn't question the ledger. The women you need to watch are not the ones who shout. They're the ones who smile and say, "Of course, dear," while quietly rearranging your life through three-way calls and backdated memos. Cynthia was the master of this social architecture. She had spent 7 years treating me like a temporary tenant in my own career, and now she was trying to use my primary business line to pay for the eviction party. Diane whispered that the bill was currently estimated at $6,500. Cynthia had instructed the waitstaff to put everything on the vineyard's corporate card, the one I had opened, the one tied to my credit score, the one I had spent thousands of hours justifying through midnight harvests and supply chain negotiations. She assumed the capital I had built was a community chest she could raid at will. Only later did I understand what that moment really meant. I looked out at the gray skyscrapers of the city, thinking of the vines waiting back at the estate. Diane told me they were about to bring out the first course. Cynthia was standing at the head of the table, tapping a crystal glass, preparing to toast the true legacy of the Callaway name. Diane whispered that Cynthia was raising her glass to the Founder's Reserve, a wine that shouldn't legally exist for another 2 months. I was the one who actually spoke to the earth. For 7 years, while Jackson handled the branding and Cynthia managed the social circle, I was the one in the dirt at 4 a.m., monitoring the moisture levels of the northern block. I knew the specific chemical signature of the soil before the sun hit the vines, a level of intimacy they viewed as mere labor rather than the soul of the business. I can admit now that part of me saw it earlier than I wanted to. I wasn't building a partnership. I was an unpaid consultant providing the foundation for a legacy that Cynthia intended to keep strictly within her bloodline. In the spring of 2022, a late frost threatened to kill the entire harvest. Jackson was at a golf retreat with his mother, discussing marketing strategies for a vintage that wouldn't have existed if I hadn't spent 48 hours straight in the rows, orchestrating the frost fans and heaters. I saved the crop. I saved the vineyard's solvency. When they returned, Cynthia didn't thank me. She walked to the window, looked at the survivors, and said, "It's wonderful how lucky Jackson is with this land." It was a systematic airbrushing. In press releases, I was the supportive spouse. In family stories, I was the diligent help. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, providing the technical expertise that won the awards while they pocketed the prestige. At the time, I thought I was being patient. I believed that in a world of variables, professional competence was the only thing I could control. I was wrong. Competence is often weaponized against the competent. They give you more work because they know you can do it. Then use that same exhaustion to keep you from noticing they're stealing the results. I remember the night I earned the master cellar key. The previous owner, a man who valued the vine over the name, handed it to me after I successfully managed a difficult fermentation. It was a heavy brass object, cold and definitive. Cynthia had watched the exchange with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the expression of a predator watching someone else find a gold coin they planned to steal later. She began to frame my hard work as a liability. She would suggest that my obsession with the harvest was taking a toll on my marriage. She would imply that a softer woman would spend more time at the country club and less time in the fermentation tanks. It was a calculated squeeze, make me feel guilty for the very labor that was funding her lifestyle. Years later, that detail still feels sharper than the rest. I was being trained to accept less while producing more. The sabotage began with the smallest of shifts. 6 months before the papers were even drafted, Cynthia's presence at the vineyard increased with the steady rhythm of a rising tide. She no longer waited for an invitation to the tasting room. She simply appeared, draped in her neutral blazers and that suffocating floral perfume, trailing a woman named Alyssa behind her like a shadow she was training to take my shape. Cynthia called it an internship, a favor for an old family friend, but to me, it felt like being forced to watch my own replacement learn my choreography. I started to notice yield discrepancies in the Northern Block minor at first. A few cases here, a fermentation log misplaced there. When I brought it to Jackson, he gave me that look of exhausted patience he had perfected. He told me I was overstressed from my recent promotion and that I was reading into things again. It is a specific kind of psychological tax being told your professional observations are actually emotional instabilities. It works like water on stone, slowly smoothing away the edges of your certainty until you can no longer distinguish between your sharp instincts and the dull hum of self-doubt they've conditioned you to feel. What I didn't recognize then was that I was caught in the invisible chains of the high-performer victim. In professional environments, we are taught that competence is protection, that if you are indispensable, you are safe. But in a toxic family system, your excellence is not an armor, it is a subsidy. I stayed because I believed that if I just outproduced Cynthia's disdain, if I just made the vineyard profitable enough, the disrespect would eventually stop. I was paying a cognitive debt that Cynthia never intended to settle. I caught her in my home office late one Tuesday afternoon. She wasn't moving things. She was holding her phone over my private fermentation logs, the light from the screen reflecting off her pearl earrings as she captured images of my proprietary data. When she heard me, she didn't flinch. She just smiled that department store smile and said, "I was just admiring your dedication, dear." Melissa could learn so much from your meticulous nature. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I simply walked to the supply closet to find a new ledger, a mundane errand for a mundane day. But there, tucked behind the extra printer cartridges, was a manila folder I hadn't seen before. It was pristine, new, and labeled in Cynthia's precise script. The folder was labeled Inventory Liquidation Alyssa's Share. I stopped being a wife that Tuesday afternoon. I stood in the supply closet, the folder cold against my palms, feeling the weight of 7 years of miscalculation. I didn't confront Cynthia or Jackson. I knew from years of managing high-stakes vineyard logistics that an emotional outburst is merely noise in a professional negotiation. It is a distraction that the predator uses to recalibrate. Instead, I began to move with the same clinical precision Cynthia had used to trap me. I hired a man named Gerald Sims, a forensic accountant who arrived at the estate under the guise of an irrigation consultant. For 3 weeks, while Cynthia was busy helping Melissa choose the right linens for the estate, Gerald sat in my back office tracing the digital ghost of my labor. It was a slow process. Real accountability doesn't happen in a single moment of dramatic discovery. It is built through the patient accumulation of undeniable facts. On the 22nd day, Gerald laid out the ledger of my betrayal. He discovered the shadow vintage. My own harvest reports, which Cynthia had pressured me to sign in haste, indicated that $285,000 worth of premium Cabernet grapes from the Northern Block had been lost to early season rot. But Gerald had cross-referenced my soil sensors and Brick's sugar-level logs. The data didn't lie, even if the family did. The grapes hadn't rotted. They had been diverted, bottled, and stored under a shell company Cynthia had registered in the next county over. Knowledge lands differently when it has a number on it. $285,000 wasn't an abstraction, it was 7 years of my life stolen while I slept. It was the physical embodiment of every 4 a.m. alarm I had ever set and every midnight frost I had fought alone. I realized then that the divorce papers weren't just a sign of a broken marriage, they were a timed financial maneuver. Cynthia wanted me legally detached from the vineyard's assets just before this lost wine hit the high-end market. That's when I realized some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. I had been the silent investor in their prestige, providing the technical soul of the brand while they prepared to liquidate my share of the harvest. I sat in my office, the familiar scent of Cynthia's floral perfume lingering in the hallway like a territorial marker. She hadn't just replaced me in her son's life. She had systematically robbed me of my career's greatest achievement, and she expected me to walk away with nothing but a signed settlement and a polite, "Of course, dear." The air in the cellar annex was thick and cold. Cynthia had boarded it up 2 years ago, claiming the foundation was settling and the space was structurally unstable. I should have checked the permit logs then, but I was still paying the emotional interest on a marriage I believed was a mutual investment. I took the heavy brass master cellar key, the one Cynthia had spent years trying to rotate out of my possession, and pressed it into the lock. It turned with a dry, mechanical protest. Inside, the darkness was occupied by hundreds of bottles of the Northern Block Cabernet, the $285,000 Lost Harvest. They weren't just stored, they were ready for distribution. I picked one up, the glass cold against my skin. The label was minimalist and expensive. It read, "The Inspiration Melissa." I didn't break the bottle. I didn't even feel the heat of an impulse. I felt a profound sense of tactical clarity. What stayed with me wasn't the theft of the grapes, it was the attempt to rebrand my labor as someone else's muse. At the time, I thought I was being patient. I was really being trained to accept less. Physical evidence made the betrayal undeniable. Some people aren't content with taking your margins. They want to colonize your identity until there is no trace left of the original architect. I stepped back out into the hallway and called Patricia Holt. My voice didn't waver. I told her the Shadow Vintage was physical, labeled, and ready to be served. Patricia advised me to maintain the current distance. She reminded me that my access to the digital temperature control systems and the inventory vault was tied to my professional viticulturist license, a credential that predated my marriage and remained independent of the divorce decree. Legally, Patricia said, her voice a clinical hum, under agricultural compliance codes, your license allows you to place a safety and quality quarantine on any inventory with disputed chemical logs. Since you flagged the bricks levels as inconsistent with the labels, the cellar is now a restricted zone until a federal audit is completed. I realized then that Cynthia's status was an overdraft on my talent. She had spent 7 years treating my expertise like a family perk, never realizing that the master key was more than a physical tool. It was a legal boundary she couldn't charm her way across. I left the boards exactly as I found them, but I adjusted the digital protocols on my phone, setting the vault to a contested asset lockdown. A notification pings on my screen. Cynthia has just attempted to swipe the Vineyard's corporate card for the 3rd time at the Gilded Cask. The transaction was instantly flagged by the dual authorization protocol. I'd quietly enabled restricting all non-operational expenses over $5,000 without my secondary digital signature. My phone rang at exactly 10:47 p.m. It was Cynthia's number, but the voice that filtered through the speaker was stripped of every ounce of its social architecture. The, of course, dear was gone, replaced by the raw, jagged panic of a woman whose credit had finally been called in. She was screaming about a declined transaction and a restaurant manager who was no longer impressed by the Callaway name. I sat in the quiet of my new apartment, the city lights reflecting off a glass of water. I didn't need to finish. I told her there was no error. I explained that the corporate account had been automatically flagged for forensic review following the filing of our dissolution papers at 9 a.m. I let the silence hang until I could hear the ambient noise of the banquet, the clink of silverware from 14 guests who were starting to realize the host was insolvent. "The vault is sealed, Alyssa," she hissed, her voice a harsh whisper. "The manager says the inventory we requested is under a legal lockout. What have you done?" "I protected the assets, Cynthia," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "The Founder's Reserve, the one you relabeled as Melissa's Inspiration, is currently listed as contested inventory under a property protection order. Until the $285,000 you diverted is returned to the Vineyard's primary account, that wine legally does not exist for consumption." That is when I realized that inherited power is often just an illusion supported by someone else's silence. Cynthia had spent decades believing she owned the vines, but she had only ever owned the paperwork. The moment the actual labor was withdrawn, her empire was revealed for what it was, a collection of expensive habits with no internal engine. Jackson took the phone then. I could hear his breathing heavy and uncertain. "Alyssa, please," he said. "This is a public event. We can work this out tomorrow. Just authorize the charge so we can finish the dinner." "You were always such a helpful boy, Jackson," I said, "trying to keep everyone happy while your mother emptied our future. But happiness isn't a currency. If you want to finish that dinner, I suggest you use your own savings. Or perhaps Melissa has a card that hasn't been flagged for embezzlement." He tried to say my name again, but I cut the connection. I didn't need to hear his explanation. I had spent 7 years interpreting his cowardice as a form of kindness, but I could finally see the ledger clearly. He was the only honest boy in a house of liars who had knowingly co-signed the fraudulent harvest reports, which made him the most dangerous enabler of them all. Cynthia's last text arrived seconds later. "You'll never work in this valley again." I didn't respond. I didn't need to work in her valley. I carried the intellectual property of my own methods, the mastery they could never replicate without my hand on the vine. The vines have turned to gold now. 6 months have passed since I watched the Callaway empire realize it was insolvent, and the air here on my new porch is crisp smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. The district attorney's office eventually declined to pursue criminal charges against Cynthia, a result my attorney warned me was always a statistical uncertainty, but the civil resolution was absolute. Cynthia was forced to liquidate her personal trust and sell her remaining shares to repay every one of those $285,000, plus the interest accrued over 14 months. She did it to avoid a public fraud referral to her church board, a price she paid only when her social capital was at risk of a total market collapse. Sometimes, that is what justice looks like. It is not always a gavel or a sentence. Often, it is simply a paper trail that follows a person permanently and a door that closes quietly, never to be reopened. Jackson moved into a small apartment on the other side of the valley. He sent one email 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, 2 paragraphs of careful, attorney-reviewed language, claiming he was sorry and hoping I could understand he was just caught between 2 people he loved. I read it once and did not respond. There was nothing in those lines that required an audit. It was an explanation, not an accountability, and I have learned to tell the difference between a genuine apology and an attempt to restructure a bad debt. Cynthia, I have not heard from at all. Through the grapevine, I learned that Melissa and Jackson are still together and that Cynthia introduces her with the same suffocating, "Of course, dear," that she used on me for 7 years. The family has reorganized itself around this new configuration, as families often do when they prefer the performance of harmony over the reality of respect. I realized then that keeping the peace is often just a polite term for funding your own exploitation. I had spent 7 years believing that if I just outproduced their disdain, I would earn my seat at the table. But some ventures are born to fail because the core partners are not invested in growth, but in control. My new position as regional director for a sustainability nonprofit requires everything I have and returns it with interest. I manage 12 people now, and my office has a view of the mountains that no one can photograph and claim as their own. I stayed late tonight not out of a sense of obligation to someone else's legacy, but because I was genuinely absorbed in the work. I arrived home in the dark to this house, and the porch received me the way the vines used to, quietly, solidly, and without condition. I sat here for an hour with a cup of coffee, exactly the strength I like watching the moonlight move across the garden. The climbing rose has finished its summer bloom and is settling into its winter skeleton, already preparing for a harvest that will belong entirely to me. Leaving that marriage was the only way to save the vines of my own identity. I had been so afraid of losing the vineyard that I almost lost the person who knew how to make it grow. The master cellar key was never about a lock in the annex. It was about the legal and emotional boundaries of my own worth. I have finally stopped interpreting Jackson's cowardice as a form of kindness. I see clearly now what we were a bad investment, that I stayed with far past the point of diminishing returns. I miss the idea of who I thought we were, but I don't miss finding out we weren't. The house behind me is lit, warm, and entirely mine. That was enough. It turned out, more than enough. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your perspective.